At 47, Helen Mercer stood outside the school where she had taught for 20 years, holding a cardboard box against her coat while cold Georgia rain soaked through her sleeves. Inside the box were picture books with taped spines, 3 sticks of chalk, a cracked coffee mug, thank you drawings from children who wrote her name in uneven letters, and the blue attendance ledger she refused to leave behind. Behind her, a janitor scraped her nameplate from the classroom door. The school board called it misconduct. The superintendent called it emotional instability. The town called it a lesson in knowing your place. 2 weeks later, with no job, no classroom, and barely enough money for groceries, Helen bought a one-room schoolhouse on Mercy Road for $13. People laughed when they heard. They said the roof sagged, the windows were broken, the floor was rotten, and the building had not heard a child's voice in 40 years. But what nobody knew was that beneath those old pine boards, sealed in dust and darkness, were names the town had spent generations trying to erase. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If stories like this matter to you, hit the like button and subscribe, because this one begins with a woman everyone had already counted out. Helen had learned early what it meant to be overlooked. She grew up at the far end of Mercy Road, in a small white house that leaned toward a ditch full of weeds. Her mother cleaned motel rooms near the highway and came home each evening with red hands, swollen feet, and coins wrapped in a handkerchief. Her father left before Helen was old enough to remember his voice. Every morning, her mother tied Helen's hair with a faded ribbon, wiped dust from her shoes, and sent her down the clay road with a biscuit folded in wax paper. At school, children from the paved streets had clean lunch pails, new pencils, and teachers who knew their family names. Helen had a second-hand dress, a cardboard folder, and the quiet habit of making herself small. In 2nd grade, her name was left off the classroom list. For 3 days, she sat on a windowsill because no desk had been assigned to her. No one shouted, no one laughed. They simply treated the mistake as if it could wait. Then Miss Althea Boone arrived as a substitute teacher. She was silver-haired, straight-backed, and carried a black handbag against her ribs. She looked at Helen on the windowsill, then at the empty space near the back row. "A child without a desk," she said, "is not a child without a place." That afternoon, Miss Boone gave Helen a sharpened yellow pencil and a sheet of lined paper. "Write your name," she said. Helen wrote it carefully. Miss Boone tapped the paper once. "Write your name where they can't erase it." Helen never forgot that sentence. Years later, when she became a teacher, Helen kept a short pencil wrapped in cotton cloth inside the top drawer of her desk. It was not the same pencil, but she treated it like a promise. She also kept her own attendance ledger, a blue cloth-bound book the district did not require. The district had computers now. It had passwords, digital forms, clean reports, and charts printed for board meetings. Helen still wrote each name by hand. Full name, date, seat number, guardian, notes. If a child missed 3 days, she wrote, "Why?" If a child came in hungry, she marked it softly in pencil. If a child's address changed twice in 1 month, she copied both addresses. If a mother worked nights at the poultry plant and could only answer calls before noon, Helen wrote that too. Other teachers said she kept records like a courthouse clerk, but Helen knew how quietly a name could vanish. No thunder, no announcement, just one line missing from one page. That was why she noticed Caleb Morris. He was 10 years old, thin as a fence rail, with muddy cuffs and a library book always tucked inside his shirt to keep it dry. One Tuesday in October, Caleb walked into Helen's classroom and sat in the 3rd row, but his name was gone from the official roster. Helen checked the lunch list. Gone. She checked the transportation sheet. Gone. She checked the district portal. Transferred. Only Caleb had not transferred anywhere. By Friday, 2 more children had disappeared from the system. By the next month, there were 7. They still came to school when they could. They still stood in the lunch line. They still raised their hands from the back of the room. But on paper, they had become withdrawals, transfers, and unverified addresses. Helen stayed late, comparing the blue ledger to the printed reports, while the hallway lights clicked off one by one. The missing children lived on the same dirt roads. Their parents worked hourly jobs. Their mailboxes leaned. Their rent changed with the season. Their mothers came to conferences in uniforms from diners, laundries, nursing homes, and poultry plants. And every time those children vanished from the count, the district's numbers looked cleaner. Helen took her questions to the office. The secretary lowered her voice and told her to leave it alone. She took them to the assistant principal. He closed his door halfway and said, "Do not make this personal." Helen emailed the superintendent with dates, names, and copies of her notes. No answer came. Then one afternoon, after recess, she found her desk drawer open. Her papers had been shifted. The blue ledger sat in the wrong place. The little pencil wrapped in cotton cloth rested on the edge of the desk, as if someone had picked it up and decided it was not worth stealing. Helen stood alone in the classroom while rain tapped the windows. 26 small desks faced the chalkboard. Paper leaves twisted under the heating vent. The room that had once felt like shelter now felt like a place being prepared for her absence. The envelope came the next morning. Plain white. No handwriting. No warning. Just Helen Mercer's name printed across the front and placed neatly at the center of her desk before the first bell rang. And when she opened it, the life she had built around other people's children began to close around her like a door. The envelope did not contain many words. Helen read them once beside her desk, then read them again because her hands had begun to tremble before her mind accepted the meaning. Administrative leave. Pending investigation. Unauthorized retention of student information. Failure to follow reporting procedures. The words looked clean beneath the district letterhead. Clean words could be crueler than shouted ones. They made harm look orderly. Outside her door, children's shoes squeaked against the hallway tile. Lockers clanged. Someone laughed near the drinking fountain. The ordinary sounds of morning kept moving around her, as if nothing had happened. When the first bell rang, no students entered her room. Instead, the assistant principal stepped through the doorway with 2 office staff members behind him. He would not look at the chalkboard, where yesterday's spelling words still waited in Helen's handwriting. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, though she had never been married and he knew it. "We need you to gather your personal belongings. My students will be here in 4 minutes. They have been reassigned for the day." The sentence struck her harder than the letter. Children moved like furniture. Teachers removed like old notices from a bulletin board. Helen looked at Caleb Morris's seat, still turned slightly toward the window. On top of it lay the bookmark he had made from folded notebook paper. "Do they know why?" she asked. "That is not your concern right now." So Helen moved slowly. She took the picture books from the shelf, lifted the cracked mug from her desk, wrapped the short pencil in cotton cloth, and tucked it into her coat pocket. Last, she picked up the blue ledger. The assistant principal's eyes dropped to it. "That stays." Helen held it against her chest. "This is mine. It contains student information. It contains the truth." For a moment, no one moved. Rain pressed against the windows. He lowered his voice. "Helen, don't make this worse." She looked at the classroom where she had tied shoes, wiped tears, found winter coats, and stayed after school with tired children. "It became worse before I noticed," she said. She walked past him before he could answer. By noon, every teacher in the building knew. By sunset, people who had never cared about school records had opinions about Helen Mercer. At the grocery store, 2 women stopped talking when she reached for eggs. At the gas station, the clerk who used to save her day-old biscuits looked away. At home, in the small rental cottage behind the feed store, Helen found a note taped to her door from Mr. Langley, the landlord. He wrote that trouble with the school district could affect his reputation. He asked her to be out by the end of the month. Inside, the cottage was quiet. A narrow bed, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, stacks of graded papers she had meant to return, a row of houseplants on the windowsill, all leaning toward the same weak light. She set the box down and sat at the table without taking off her wet coat. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to cry. Not loudly. The tears simply slipped down and darkened the front of her blouse while the refrigerator hummed in the corner. She cried because she had no husband to call, no grown children to defend her, no brother with a spare room, no father waiting at the end of Mercy Road. Her mother had been gone 9 years. Miss Althea Boone had been gone longer than that. And still, even through grief, her mind kept sorting facts. 7 children missing from the roster. 3 marked transferred. 2 marked withdrawn. 1 listed under an address that had never existed. Caleb Morris removed from lunch eligibility the same week the district announced improved attendance numbers. Helen wiped her face and opened the blue ledger. Page after page held the small proof of small lives. Caleb liked weather books. Tasha Green needed glasses. Eli Turner lived with his aunt after his mother's night shifts became double shifts. Maribel Cruz translated for her grandmother at conferences. These were not errors. Errors were random. This had a shape. The next morning, Helen drove back to the administration building and asked for a meeting. She waited 40 minutes on a vinyl chair beneath a framed photograph of smiling board members. When Warren Pike finally came out, he wore a navy suit and the expression of a man already tired of generosity. Warren was chairman of the school board, grandson of a judge, owner of 3 rental properties, and a person who used the word community whenever he meant control. "Helen," he said, "you need to rest. I need access to the records." "No. You need perspective." She placed copies of her notes on the counter between them. Children have been removed from enrollment while still attending. Their lunch records were changed. Their addresses were altered. I want to know who authorized it. Warren did not look at the papers. "You are a good teacher when you stay in your lane," he said. "But you are confusing compassion with competence." Helen felt the old wound open, the same one that had begun on a windowsill when she was 7. A poor child is easy to misplace. A poor woman is easy to dismiss. A poor teacher, once accused, is easy to erase. But Helen had spent her whole life writing names down. "You can lock me out of the system," she said quietly. "But you cannot make me forget who was there." Warren's face hardened. "Be careful," he said. "Memory is not evidence." Helen stepped out into the wet afternoon, holding her folder beneath her coat. For the first time, she understood that the missing names were not a mistake waiting to be corrected. They were a door someone had built, and someone powerful was standing on the other side, holding it shut. Helen lasted 9 days on administrative leave before they called her to the board hearing. It was held on a Thursday evening in the district office, in a room with beige walls, metal folding chairs, and a long table where 6 board members sat with bottled water in front of them. A small American flag stood in the corner. On the wall behind Warren Pike hung a framed motto in gold letters: "Every child matters." Helen looked at those words longer than she meant to. No parents had been invited. No students, no teachers who might speak for her. The meeting had been posted as a personnel review, which meant the people most affected by the truth were kept outside the door. Helen wore her gray dress, the one she had worn every first day of school for 11 years. She had mended the hem twice. In her handbag were her blue ledger, the short pencil wrapped in cotton cloth, and copies of every page she had dared to make before they locked her out of the system. Warren Pike opened the folder in front of him, as if he had already read everything worth knowing. "Miss Mercer," he said, "this hearing concerns your repeated violation of district procedures, your inappropriate handling of confidential student information, and your refusal to follow administrative direction." Helen sat straight in the chair. "I reported children who were removed from enrollment while still attending school." A woman at the end of the table sighed softly. Warren folded his hands. "You reported assumptions. I reported names. You reported emotional impressions based on incomplete data." Helen looked from one board member to another. Some avoided her eyes. One man pretended to read the same page 3 times. The superintendent sat beside Warren with a tight mouth and a pen she never used. "They were in my classroom," Helen said. "Caleb Morris was in seat 11 on the same day your system said he had transferred." "And where is Caleb Morris now?" Warren asked. Helen paused. She did not know. His mother had not answered the phone. Their mailbox had been empty for days. The small house off Beach Road looked shut up when Helen drove by. Warren let the silence sit in the room. "That is the problem," he said. "You do not know. Yet you built accusations around it." A district attorney, a pale man with rimless glasses, slid a paper forward. He explained that if Helen continued speaking publicly about district records, the board could pursue legal action, misuse of student information, defamation, theft of files. The words were chosen to frighten a person without money. Helen knew that. Everyone in the room knew that. Still, fear moved through her body like cold water. She thought of the cottage behind the feed store, the rent due, the houseplants on the sill, the boxes she had not yet packed because some part of her had believed reason might still work. Warren read the final statement himself. Effective immediately, Helen Mercer's employment with the county school district is terminated. The sentence landed without echo. There was no gasp, no raised voice, no dramatic turning point. Just a paper sliding across a table and a woman's life being separated from the place she had given it to. Helen stood. The superintendent finally looked at her. "I'm sorry it ended this way." Helen picked up her handbag. "No," she said. "You're sorry I noticed." She walked out before they could tell her the meeting was adjourned. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty. Rain had stopped, but water still dripped from the pine trees along the edge of the pavement. Helen sat in her car with both hands on the steering wheel until the board members began leaving one by one. Warren came out last. He did not look toward her car. The next morning, Mr. Langley came to the cottage with his cap in his hands and a shamefaced look that did not make him kinder. "I hate to do this, Helen." "Then don't." He stared at the porch boards. "Folks are talking. My wife says it's better if we don't get pulled into anything. I have paid rent on time for 6 years. I know. I kept your mother's medicine schedule when she broke her hip. I know that too. But knowing did not change anything. That was one of the hardest lessons of Helen's life. People could know the truth and still choose comfort. He gave her 10 days. Helen spent the first 2 selling what she could. The small television went to a man from the next county. The extra chair went to a church basement. Her mother's sewing machine, which no longer worked, brought $8 from a woman who wanted it for decoration. Helen almost changed her mind at the last second, but the woman had already loaded it into her truck. Helen kept only what fit in her old station wagon: clothes, books, a kettle, a blanket, a lamp, her teaching supplies, the blue ledger, and a wooden crate of student drawings she could not bring herself to throw away. On the 6th day, she went to the courthouse to ask about low-cost housing and found a notice taped to a bulletin board near the tax office. County surplus property auction. Most listings were scraps of land, drainage lots, buildings no one wanted to insure. Then she saw it. Former one-room schoolhouse. Mercy Road. Minimum bid, $13. Condition, unsafe. No utilities confirmed. Structure sold as is. Helen read the address twice. Mercy Road. The same road where she had grown up. The same road where poor children walked too far and disappeared too easily from official maps. At the auction, only 4 people came inside. 2 were there for a tractor shed. 1 wanted a strip of land behind his barn. No one bid on the schoolhouse. The clerk looked over his glasses. "Miss Mercer, you understand this building is not habitable." "I understand. No plumbing on record. Roof damage. Possible foundation rot." "I understand. Most folks would tear it down for salvage." Helen opened her purse and counted $13 onto the table. Behind her, someone chuckled. "A fired teacher buying a dead school," a man said. "Sounds about right." Helen did not turn around. The clerk stamped the paper, slid it toward her, and pointed where she needed to sign. Her hand shook only once. Then, Helen Mercer wrote her name. The deed felt heavier than paper. Helen placed it on the passenger seat of her station wagon and drove back to the cottage without turning on the radio. The rain had stopped, but the county still looked wet and bruised. Puddles shone in the ditches, pine branches bent low over the road, dripping slowly onto the windshield. She had 3 days left before Mr. Langley wanted the keys. So she packed the way she had packed classrooms for 20 years. Books in milk crates, clothes in garbage bags, kitchen things wrapped in newspaper, student drawings laid flat between cardboard, important papers sealed in a biscuit tin, the blue ledger on the front seat, where she could see it. By the final morning, the cottage looked like a room being erased. Pale rectangles remained on the walls where pictures had hung. Dust showed behind the furniture she had sold. Her houseplants sat in a box by the door, their leaves trembling whenever wind slipped through the open window. Helen stood in the kitchen for a moment. For 6 years, This had been where she graded papers, ate soup alone, mended hems, and woke before dawn to drive to school. It had never belonged to her, not fully, but it had held the shape of her life. She wiped the counter clean, placed the key on the table, and walked out. The station wagon was packed so tightly she could not see through the back window. A lamp lay across the passenger floor. 2 crates of books were tied down with clothesline. On top of everything rested the wooden sign from her classroom reading corner. A name is a beginning. Helen had painted those words during her first year of teaching. Back then, she thought they were for children. Now, she understood they had been for her too. Mercy Road began behind the old church and stretched east into the part of the county people forgot until they needed someone to blame. The pavement ended after 2 miles. Then the road turned to red clay, soft at the edges and ribbed with truck tracks. Helen drove slowly. Branches scraped the car doors. Kudzu swallowed fence posts. Mailboxes leaned over the ditch with faded numbers and rusted flags. She passed the house where she had grown up. The white clapboard had gone gray. One side of the porch had collapsed. Weeds filled the yard where her mother once hung sheets in the sun. No smoke rose from the chimney. No light showed in the windows. Helen slowed, but she did not stop. Some griefs could only be greeted from the road. She touched the cotton-wrapped pencil in her coat pocket and kept driving. A mile later, the newer county school appeared on a hill beyond the trees. Its driveway opened toward the paved side of town, toward the brick houses, trimmed lawns, and clean sidewalks. Even from a distance, Helen could see bright windows, a polished flagpole, and yellow buses lined up in perfect rows. She wondered how many children had stood near that brightness and still been counted as absent. After that, the road narrowed. Pines pressed close. Rainwater ran in red streams along the ditches. The sky lowered until the afternoon looked almost like evening. Helen turned on the headlights. At the next bend, she saw the first sign, not the schoolhouse, only the sign. It leaned beside the road, half buried in vines, 2 weathered boards nailed to a split post. Most of the paint had peeled away, but when Helen stepped out and pulled back the wet kudzu, she saw the faint letters, Mercy School. Below them was a pale scar, where another word had been scraped away. Helen ran her fingers over the damaged wood. Someone had wanted that word gone. The schoolhouse stood beyond the sign, at the end of a narrow track cut through weeds and clay. Helen drove as far as she could before the tires sank. Then she stopped and sat behind the wheel. The building was smaller than she expected. 1 room, 1 crooked chimney, 4 tall windows, 2 broken. A front door hanging slightly open. A roof bowed in the middle like something tired of standing. Weeds grew around the steps. A pine branch lay across the porch. The bell tower was empty. When Helen opened the car door, crows lifted from the roof and scattered into the damp air. She stepped into the mud. The place smelled of wet pine, red clay, rotting leaves, and old silence. Helen carried the first box to the porch and set it beside the broken door. For 1 weak second, she wanted to turn around. She wanted a working sink, a locked door, a real bed, a voice in the next room. She wanted someone to say this was courage and not desperation. But there was no one. Only the schoolhouse. Only the deed. Only $13 worth of shelter at the end of Mercy Road. Helen lifted the box again, pushed the door open with her shoulder, and stepped inside. The floor groaned beneath her. Dust rose in a pale cloud. And somewhere below the old pine boards, too deep to see, the building answered with a hollow sound. Inside, the schoolhouse smelled like wet wood and years of closed air. Helen stood just past the doorway, holding a box against her hip, while gray lights slipped through the broken windows. Leaves had gathered in the corners. Dust floated over the floor. A bird's nest sat above the cracked blackboard, tucked into a place where plaster had fallen away. 6 old desks leaned near the back wall. A teacher's table stood at the front, one leg braced with a brick. The blackboard was split down the middle, but it was still there. Helen set the box on the table. The table held. That felt like something. She carried in the rest of her life 1 load at a time. Books, blanket, kettle, lamp, biscuit tin, houseplants, and the crate of children's drawings. By the last trip, her shoes were heavy with red mud, and her coat smelled of rain. The schoolhouse had no electricity, no running water, no bathroom except an outhouse hidden behind weeds. The nearest neighbor was too far to see. Helen looked around the room. "Well," she whispered, "I have had worse classrooms." Her voice sounded small, but it did not break. She began with the windows. She tore cardboard from a packing box and tacked it over the broken panes with the little hammer from her teaching kit. Then she swept. Dust rose in thick clouds, dead beetles rolled from the corners. Under one desk, she found a dry snakeskin and carried it outside on the end of a ruler. She dragged the desks against the wall. One came apart in her hands, and she saved the straight pieces for kindling. By evening, she had cleared a corner near the stove. The stove was black iron, rusted but whole. Helen knelt before it and opened the little door. Old Ash sat inside, pale and dry. Dry ash meant the chimney might still pull. Behind the stove, she found a narrow wood box. Most of the logs inside had rotted, but near the bottom were 6 pieces still solid enough to burn. Helen carried them carefully, as if they were bread. She twisted newspaper, laid splinters from the broken desk across it, and struck a match. The first flame died. The second caught, shook blue, then rose yellow. Smoke pushed into the room. Helen coughed, opened the stove door wider, and waited. For a few long seconds, the smoke thickened. Then the chimney pulled. The fire took. A small orange glow filled the belly of the stove. Warmth touched Helen's hands. The schoolhouse had given her fire. Not comfort, not safety, but fire. After dark, rain returned. It tapped the roof, then found the weak places. Helen moved her blanket twice before finding a dry patch near the teacher's table. She put a bucket under one leak and a cooking pot under another. She ate crackers and peanut butter by lamplight. The room changed with fire in it. The broken windows became dark mirrors. The desks looked less like wreckage and more like witnesses. The blackboard held the glow softly, as if it remembered children. Helen took a piece of chalk from her box and walked to the front of the room. For a moment, she only stood there. Then she wrote, "Helen Mercer, teacher." The chalk squeaked. The words looked small on the cracked board. Still, they were there. The district could take her classroom. Warren Pike could take her keys, her paycheck, her nameplate, and every password she had ever used. But this board had no password. This room had no superintendent. This forgotten place asked for nothing except work. Helen slept badly that first night. The floor was hard beneath her blanket. Wind slipped through the cardboard seams. A mouse scratched inside the wall. Once, a branch struck the roof and made her sit upright, heart hammering. But no one knocked. No one ordered her out. No one told her to be quiet. At dawn, pale light entered through the patched windows. Helen rose stiffly, fed the stove, and stepped outside with the kettle. Rainwater had collected in a dented barrel beneath the eave. It was dirty on top, clear below. She dipped carefully, boiled what she could, and made weak tea in her cracked mug. Then she began again. She cleared weeds from the front steps. She found the path to the outhouse. She pulled vines from the leaning sign until Mercy School showed through the weathered paint. The scraped place beneath the words bothered her. It was not ordinary peeling. Someone had cut at the wood, again and again, until another word had nearly disappeared. Helen touched the scar with her thumb, then looked back at the silent building. By noon, sweat had replaced the morning chill. She returned inside and decided to move the teacher's table closer to the stove. She pushed one side, then the other. The table scraped forward an inch. Beneath it, the floor answered. Hollow. Helen stopped. She pressed her heel lightly against the plank. The sound came again, low and empty, deeper than an old board should sound. She knelt and brushed dust from the floor. The nails near the table were darker than the others. A faint line ran across several planks, almost hidden beneath dirt, as if that part of the floor had once been lifted and set back down. Her fingers followed the seam. The schoolhouse grew still around her. For a moment, Helen forgot the rain, the hearing, the landlord, even Warren Pike. She saw only the boards, the dark nails, and the place where a teacher would have stood every morning. She was too tired to pry anything open that day, too hungry, too cold, too alone. So she pushed the table back over the seam and told herself it could wait. But that night, while the stove breathed orange in the dark and rain whispered over the roof, Helen lay awake listening to the floor. The schoolhouse was ruined. It was damp, broken, and forgotten. But it was hers. And for the first time, Helen wondered whether it had been forgotten on purpose. Morning came cold and gray. Helen woke before the sun, not because she had slept well, but because the schoolhouse had kept speaking in small sounds all night. The stove settled, the roof clicked, rainwater dripped into the bucket. Somewhere beneath the teacher's table, the floor gave one soft knock whenever the wind pressed against the walls. After tea, Helen stood over the seam with the little hammer in her hand. She had told herself it could wait, but teachers learned to distrust things that waited too neatly. She dragged the teacher's table aside. Dust showed the square where it had stood for years. Beneath it, the boards were darker, less worn than the rest of the floor. Not new, exactly, but replaced at a different time. Helen knelt and pushed the hammer claw under the first plank. The wood resisted. She worked slowly. If there was only rot beneath, she did not want to break the floor more than necessary. If there was nothing, she did not want to feel foolish for hoping. The first nail came loose with a dry squeal. Then the second. When the plank lifted, a breath of cold air rose from below. Helen stopped. Not rot. Space. She leaned closer and saw another layer of wood beneath the first. Narrow boards, older, nailed crosswise like someone had covered something in a hurry. Between two of those boards was a crack no wider than a finger. Something pale rested inside it. Helen used the tip of the pencil from her teaching kit to ease it free. It was paper, dry, brittle, folded twice. She carried it to the window where the morning light was strongest and opened it with both hands. At first, the writing looked like scratches. Then, the words began to separate. Names. A list of names. Children's names. Some were written in careful ink. Others had been crossed through so heavily that the paper had nearly torn. Beside each name was an age, a road, and a mark Helen did not understand. A small circle, a dash, the letter T. Helen's mouth went dry. The paper was old, much older than her own records. The ink had faded brown. The corner carried a date from 1968. She read the first clear name. Amos Gray, age 8, Mercy Road. Helen looked toward the empty doorway. Reverend Amos Gray lived near the old Baptist church. He was white-haired now, bent at the shoulders, known for repairing hymnals and bringing soup to grieving families. But here was his name, written in a child's place, then crossed out. Helen sat back on her heels. The room seemed to tilt slightly around her. She read more. Ruthie Bell, Samuel Pike, Della Freeman, Jonah Lee, Amos Gray. Some names were crossed out, some were circled. Some had the word transferred written beside them in a hand that looked too neat, too final. Helen had seen that word recently. Transferred. Caleb Morris had been marked the same way. So had Tasha Green. So had Eli Turner. She folded the paper carefully and placed it inside her blue ledger. For several minutes, she did not move. This was not proof. Not yet. A scrap of old paper could mean anything. A teacher knew better than to build a whole lesson from one sentence. But Helen also knew patterns. And this pattern had just reached backward 40 years. By noon, she drove to the church. The old Baptist church stood near the paved part of Mercy Road, white paint peeling from its steeple, cemetery stones leaning behind it. Reverend Amos Gray was sweeping pine needles from the front steps when Helen parked. He looked up before she spoke. "Miss Mercer," he said, "folks say you bought the old school." "I did. That building ought to have fallen down long ago." "It hasn't." "No," he said quietly. "It hasn't." Helen took the folded paper from her ledger and held it out. "I found this under the floor." The Reverend did not reach for it at first. His eyes lowered to the page, and something changed in his face. Not surprise. Recognition. He took off his glasses, wiped them with a handkerchief, and put them back on. "Where exactly did you find it?" "Under the teacher's table." His jaw tightened. Some rooms, he said, were closed for a reason. What reason? He looked past her, down Mercy Road, toward the trees hiding the schoolhouse. For a long moment, Helen heard only the broom handle creak in his hand. When I was a boy, he said, that school had two names, one on the board, one in people's mouths. Helen thought of the scraped sign. What was the other name? Reverend Gray did not answer. Instead, he folded the paper once and handed it back. You should leave that place alone. I can't. You don't understand what kind of people kept records like that. I understand what kind of children get removed from them. His eyes lifted to hers then. The silence between them changed. Helen saw it. Not refusal, but fear. An old fear, polished by years of practice. Reverend Gray, she said softly, your name is on this page. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet but steady. I know. Helen waited. He looked toward the church doors, then at the road again. I was 8 years old, he said. My mother walked me there every morning. Then one day, they told her I had been transferred. Where? A bitter smile touched his mouth. That was the question, Miss Mercer. Wind moved through the pines beside the church. Helen held the old paper against her ledger, feeling the two records pressed together across time. One from 1968. One from now. Different children. Same word. Transferred. Reverend Gray stepped back onto the church porch. I can't help you, he said. But he did not sound like a man who meant forever. Helen returned to the schoolhouse before dusk. The hollow place waited beneath the teacher's table. This time, she did not cover it. She set the old list beside her blue ledger, lit the lamp, and looked at the crossed-out names until the room grew dark around her. She did not yet know what lay below the second layer of boards. She did not know who had hidden it. She did not know why the town had spent so many years pretending the old school was only an empty shell. But she knew one thing. Someone had been erasing children long before Caleb Morris disappeared from her roster. The rain came hard that night. It began as a steady tapping on the roof, then deepened into a roar that filled the schoolhouse and pressed the darkness close to the windows. Helen lay awake beneath her blanket, listening to water find every weak place in the old building. One leak fell into the bucket near the stove. Another struck the teacher's table. A third began somewhere beneath the floor. At first, Helen thought she had imagined it. Then she heard it again. A faint dripping sound from inside the hollow space, slow and patient, as if the schoolhouse had started counting time for her. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the room smelled sharper, wetter. A thin line of muddy water had crept from beneath the loosened boards near the teacher's table. Helen made tea with boiled rainwater, drank half of it standing, then took the hammer, a screwdriver, and the small pry bar she had found in the storage box. She moved slowly. The first top plank came up easier than before. The second split near the nail. The third groaned, then lifted with a puff of old dust. Below was the second layer of boards, the hidden layer. Helen worked at it for nearly an hour. Her hands cramped. A sliver of wood cut the pad of her thumb. Twice she had to stop and breathe through the ache in her back. When the last crossboard loosened, cold air rose from below. Not crawl space air, room air. Helen held the lamp over the opening. A narrow staircase descended beneath the schoolhouse. Only 5 steps were visible at first, steep and dark, coated in red dust. The walls were rough timber. At the bottom, something pale rested against a post. Helen sat back so quickly the lamp shook in her hand. For a long moment, she did not move. Every sensible part of her said to close the floor, drive away, find Reverend Gray, find anyone. But there was another part of Helen, older than caution, formed on a second-grade windowsill, with no desk assigned to her. That part knew what happened when people waited for permission. She wrapped her thumb with a handkerchief, picked up the lamp, and climbed down. The air below was close and dry, not fresh, but sealed. The kind of air that had been holding its breath for decades. The basement was low enough that Helen had to bend her head. It stretched farther than the classroom above, running beneath the front half of the building. Shelves lined one wall. Against another stood 3 wooden crates, a metal file box, and a stack of oilcloth bundles tied with string. The pale shape near the post was not a bone, as her frightened mind had first thought. It was a school slate, On it, written in chalk so faint she nearly missed it, were 4 words. Count them anyway. Helen touched the edge of the slate, the chalk blurred beneath her fingers. She set the lamp on a crate and opened the metal box first. Inside were files, dozens of them. Some were brittle with age. Some were wrapped in newspaper. Some had been copied by hand onto lined paper. Most were labeled by year. 19百64 1965 1966 1967 1968 1969 Helen felt her breath shorten. This had not happened once. She lifted the first folder. Enrollment Summary. Mercy School. Above, 1968. Behind it was a second sheet with more names than the official page. Besides several names, someone had written, removed, transferred, address unverified, family relocated. But tucked behind those sheets were letters. Dear Miss Boone, please do not take Samuel off the list. He walks there every morning. My daughter Della was not transferred. We have no car to transfer her anywhere. Please keep my boy's name. If his name is gone, they will say he was never there. Helen lowered herself onto the bottom step. The basement seemed to tilt around her. Miss Althea Boone's name appeared again and again in the margins. Sometimes as a signature, sometimes as initials, sometimes as small notes written in careful cursive. Copy kept, original altered. Parent came in tears. Child still present. Do not trust county report. Helen pressed one hand to her mouth. Miss Boone had known. The woman who gave Helen her first pencil, the woman who told her to write her name where they could not erase it, had spent years doing exactly that for other children. Helen opened another bundle. Inside were attendance sheets from the newer county school, years after the one-room schoolhouse had supposedly closed. These were not originals. They were copies, smuggled or mailed or carried here by someone who understood the danger of one official version. The same words repeated through the decades. Transferred, withdrawn, unverified, inactive, and beside them, in Miss Boone's hand or another teacher's, were corrections. Still attending. Saw child at lunch. Mother reports, no move. Bus skipped road. Denied re-entry. Helen found a small ledger wrapped in blue cloth, so faded it looked gray. For a moment, she thought of her own book upstairs. The handwriting inside was Miss Boone's. Not a diary exactly. More a record of conscience. They tell me clean numbers bring clean funding. But a child is not dirt to be swept from a report. W. Pike says the county cannot afford to count children who do not help the county look improved. If I send this through the office, it disappears. So I will leave it where only a teacher might look. Helen read the sentence twice. W. Pike. Warren Pike's grandfather had been William Pike, former judge, former board chairman, the man whose portrait still hung in the district office hallway. Helen turned the page. There were references to funding grants, attendance bonuses, state reports, building allocations. Children from Mercy Road and other poor roads had been marked as unstable, unreachable, transferred, or unverified, so the district could remove them from performance counts while still claiming funds tied to enrollment cycles. The language changed with each decade. The act did not. At the bottom of the crate, Helen found newer documents. Not from Miss Boone. These had been added after her death. Copies of emails, budget charts, printed rosters with names highlighted, notes in a handwriting Helen did not recognize. Someone else had continued the record. And there, clipped to a page from the current school year, was Caleb Morris's name. Transferred. Helen's knees weakened. She reached for the crate beside her and found photographs in envelopes. Class pictures, church picnic snapshots. Children lined outside the old schoolhouse in patched clothes and serious expressions. On the back of one photograph, someone had written, "The ones they said were not there." Helen could not stop the tears then. They came quietly, but they came from a place deeper than the grief of losing a job. She cried for Caleb, for Reverend Gray, for Della Freeman and Samuel Pike, for mothers who wrote letters with shaking hands, for Miss Boone, hiding paper beneath a floor because no office would keep the truth. And, though she did not want to, she cried for the little girl on the windowsill who had waited 3 days for someone to say her name belonged on a list. The final bundle was wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a red string. Inside was a sealed envelope. On the front, in Miss Boone's handwriting, were the words, "For the teacher who still counts them." Helen sat very still. Then she opened it. The letter was only 1 page. It did not explain everything. It did not need to. It named where the records came from, which reports had been changed, which officials had ordered it, and which families had begged for help. It also named the schoolhouse itself as a protected community school building, never legally transferred for demolition, never properly closed under state law. Helen understood the value then. Not money, not treasure, something harder to hold and harder to destroy. Evidence, history, a legal thread, a moral debt. The schoolhouse was not just shelter. It was a witness. The children had not vanished. Their names had been hidden below the place where teachers once stood. Helen gathered the folders carefully. She did not take everything. Not yet. She knew enough about evidence to know panic could ruin proof. She photographed each shelf with her old phone. She copied labels into her blue ledger. She wrapped the current year documents in a clean towel and carried them upstairs. When she climbed back into the classroom, sunlight had broken through the clouds. It fell across the cracked blackboard, across the words she had written there. Helen Mercer, teacher. Helen placed Caleb's copied roster on the teacher's table. Beside it, she placed the 1,968 list with Reverend Gray's name, different years, different children, same erasure. Then, she picked up a piece of chalk and wrote one more sentence beneath her name. Every child counted. The words trembled slightly because her hand was shaking, but they stayed. The first mistake Helen made was believing paper could sit quietly. By noon, she had driven to the copy shop outside the county line because she no longer trusted any machine in town. She copied Caleb Morris's roster page, the 1,968 list, Miss Boone's letter, and 3 pages from the funding summaries. She kept the originals wrapped in a towel inside her biscuit tin. The young man behind the counter glanced at the old pages only once. "School project?" he asked. "Something like that," Helen said. When she returned to Mercy Road, a county truck was parked in front of the schoolhouse. 2 men stood on the porch. One wore a building inspector's badge clipped to his belt. The other was Deputy Carl Maddox, who had once handed out safety stickers during Fire Prevention Week. Helen stopped beside her car. "Can I help you?" The inspector looked at the sagging roof, then at his clipboard. "This structure has been reported unsafe for occupancy. It was sold to me as is. As is does not mean you can live in a hazard." Deputy Maddox shifted his weight. He would not meet her eyes. Helen looked past them. The schoolhouse door stood open. "Did you go inside?" "County property concern," the inspector said. "It is my property. For now." The words were too quick, too practiced. Helen felt the biscuit tin under her arm grow heavier. The inspector handed her a notice. Condemnation review. Emergency safety evaluation. Possible demolition. The date for review was 3 days away. 3 days? Helen said. "That is the schedule." "No, that is a warning." The inspector said nothing. After they left, Helen walked through the schoolhouse slowly. Nothing obvious had been taken, but the teacher's table had been moved. One crate near the basement opening sat a few inches from where she had left it. Someone knew. That evening, Warren Pike came himself. He arrived in a clean black truck that looked out of place in the mud. He did not step off the path until he had studied the puddles, as if even Mercy Road should arrange itself for his shoes. Helen stood on the porch, with her coat buttoned. "You should have called before coming," she said. "I came to help you." "No, you didn't." Warren gave a patient smile. "Helen, this has gone too far. You are living in a dangerous building, spreading accusations, and placing yourself in legal trouble you cannot afford. Then why are you here alone?" His smile thinned. He took an envelope from inside his coat and held it out. "I can make this easier. $5,000 for the property. More than fair considering you paid $13,000. Helen did not take the envelope. "Why would you pay $5,000 for a dead school?" "Because I have sympathy for your situation. You had no sympathy when you took my classroom. You lost your classroom because you made poor choices." "No, I lost it because I kept records. For the first time, Warren's eyes moved past her, into the building. Helen noticed. She stepped sideways, blocking the doorway. "You found something," he said. The wind moved through the weeds. Far off, a crow called from the pines. Helen kept her voice calm. "I found what teachers usually find when they stay after everyone else leaves. Names." Warren folded the envelope slowly. "You are not qualified to interpret old documents. I am qualified to read. You have no idea what those papers mean. Then why are you afraid of them?" His face hardened. "Be careful, Helen. People have been kind because they remember you as a teacher. That can change. It already has." Warren looked at her for a long moment, then returned to his truck. Before he drove away, he lowered the window. "Take the money," he said, "before this place costs you more than you understand." The next night, someone tried to break in. Helen woke to the sound of glass cracking near the back window. She sat up on the floor, heart striking hard against her ribs. The stove had burned low. The room was dark, except for a thin red glow behind the iron door. Another sound came, a boot on wood. Helen did not scream. She reached for the lamp, then stopped. Light would show where she was. Instead, she took the poker from beside the stove and stood behind the teacher's table. The back door shuddered. Once, twice. Then, a voice whispered something she could not make out. Helen looked at the biscuit tin beneath the stove. The originals were not there anymore. Before sleeping, she had wrapped them in oilcloth and lowered them into the empty rain barrel outside, beneath a false layer of leaves. The tin under the stove held only old worksheets and blank forms. The door gave way with a splintering crack. A man stepped inside. His face was hidden by a cap and scarf. He moved quickly toward the teacher's table, not like a thief looking for money, but like someone searching a place he already knew mattered. Helen lifted the poker. "Stop." The man froze. For 1 second, neither moved. Then, he lunged for the table. Helen swung. The poker struck the table edge with a loud iron crack, missing his hand by an inch. The sound startled them both. The man stumbled back, cursed, and ran for the broken door. Helen followed only as far as the threshold. The night swallowed him. She stood barefoot on the cold boards, shaking so hard the poker rattled in her grip. By morning, the story had already changed in town. Helen Mercer had imagined a break-in. Helen Mercer had threatened a man. Helen Mercer was unstable. At the grocery store, no one stood near her in line. At the post office, 2 women lowered their voices. Someone had written "crazy teacher" in chalk on the schoolhouse sign. Helen washed it off with rainwater and a rag. Her hands were still red from scrubbing when Deputy Maddox returned. This time, he came alone. "I need to ask about county records," he said. "You mean take them?" "I mean ask." Helen studied him. He looked tired, older than he had 2 days ago. "I found my father's signature on one of the old notices," he said quietly. "I don't know what that means." "It means the truth is bigger than one man." He swallowed. "I cannot protect you if you keep originals here." "I know." "Then don't." He placed a card on the teacher's table. A state investigator's office. No explanation. No promise. Just a door, barely opened. After he left, Helen copied the number into her blue ledger. That afternoon, Warren's envelope still lay unopened where he had dropped it in the mud. Helen picked it up, tore it in half, and fed it to the stove. As the paper curled into flame, she looked at Caleb's name on the board, then at the growing list beneath it. "No," she whispered. "This goes out under their names." Deputy Maddox's card stayed on the teacher's table until morning. Helen walked past it 3 times before touching it. The number belonged to the State Education Fraud Office in Atlanta. She had never called an investigator before. She had never imagined a classroom could lead to one. She looked at the blackboard. Caleb Morris, Tasha Green, Eli Turner, Amos Gray, Dilla Freeman. Different years, different roads. The same quiet erasure. Helen made the call. She gave dates, names, document types, and the location of the hidden records. The woman on the other end asked careful questions and did not interrupt. When Helen finished, the investigator said, "Do not give the originals to any local official unless we send written authorization." Helen closed her eyes. "All right. Can you keep yourself safe?" Helen looked at the patched windows, the broken door, the stove, and the scar on the teacher's table where the poker had struck. "I can keep the records safe," she said. "That is not what I asked." Before Helen could answer, tires sounded outside. An old blue pickup stopped near the sign. Reverend Amos Gray stepped out slowly, carrying a cardboard box in both arms. Helen met him on the porch. "I thought you couldn't help me," she said. "I said I couldn't." He looked down at the box. "I did not say I wouldn't." Inside were church envelopes, yellowed photographs, baptism records, and letters tied with string. "My mother kept these," he said. "After they told her I had been transferred, she never trusted the school office again." Helen cleared the teacher's table. Reverend Gray stood in the doorway before entering. His eyes moved across the desks, the stove, the cracked blackboard, and the open boards in the floor. "I have not stepped inside this room in 60 years, he said. "What do you remember?" He touched the back of an old desk. "Too much." By noon, he had told her about children who waited outside the newer school after the old one closed. Some were accepted late. Some were sent home for missing papers their parents had already brought. Some stopped coming because nobody came looking. He spoke slowly, as if every sentence had to be lifted from deep water. Near sunset, another car arrived. Rachel Dunn stepped out with a camera bag and a reporter's notebook. Helen recognized her at once, though the nervous fifth grader she remembered had become a woman with sharp eyes and rain-dark hair. "I work for the regional paper now," Rachel said. "Deputy Maddox called my editor. He said there might be something on Mercy Road worth seeing." Helen glanced toward the road. "He called you?" "Not officially." Reverend Gray gave a soft cough that almost became a laugh. Rachel photographed the blackboard, the open floor, the old lists, the church records, and the scraped sign outside. Then she lowered her camera. "Miss Mercer," she said, using the name from childhood, "this is not just a school story." "No," Helen said, "it is a children's story." Rachel wrote that down. 2 days later, Marcus Vale arrived from legal aid in the next county. He was thin, tired, and carried a briefcase held shut by one silver latch. He sat at the teacher's table for hours, sorting documents into piles. Historical records, current year records, financial reports, witness letters, property status. At last, he leaned back. "Helen," he said, "this is enough to start something. Is it enough to finish something?" "Not alone," she nodded. "What do we need?" "Families, witnesses, proof that the erased names belong to real children who were denied services or hidden from reports. People willing to stand in public." Reverend Gray looked down at his hands. "That will be the hard part," he said. It was. The first mother Helen visited would not open the door. The first grandfather said he had already lost enough. One aunt stared at her nephew's altered record until her mouth tightened, then handed it back. "You don't understand," she said. "They can still hurt us." Helen did understand, so she stopped asking people to be brave before they were ready. Instead, she opened the schoolhouse every afternoon. She swept the floor, made coffee on the stove, and set the old desks in a circle. Reverend Gray came first, then Rachel, then Marcus, then Deputy Maddox, standing near the door without his hat. On the 4th day, Tasha Green's mother came with a grocery bag full of papers. On the 5th, Eli Turner's aunt brought his birth certificate, 3 report cards, and a photograph of him holding a perfect spelling test. On the 6th, Caleb Morris's mother arrived. She looked exhausted. In her hands was Caleb's library book. "He asked if you were still his teacher," she said. Helen had to grip the back of a chair before answering. "Yes," she said, "if he wants me to be." By the end of the week, the blackboard was full. Not accusations, names. Helen wrote each one slowly, asking for spelling, dates, roads, mothers, fathers, grandmothers, and stories. The schoolhouse was still broken, still cold, still patched with cardboard and stubbornness, but it was no longer empty. The forgotten room had become what it had always been meant to be, a place where children were counted. The hearing was scheduled for 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. Warren Pike called it a public safety review. The notice said the county would determine whether the old Mercy Road schoolhouse posed a danger to the community and should be demolished immediately. Helen read the notice 3 times by lamplight. Danger to the community. She looked around the room where mothers had brought birth certificates, where Reverend Gray had spoken his own erased name aloud, where Caleb's library book rested on the teacher's table beside Miss Boone's letter. The schoolhouse had not endangered the community. It had remembered it. By 6:30, the county meeting hall was already full. Helen arrived in her gray dress with her blue ledger under one arm and a cardboard evidence box in both hands. Marcus Vale walked beside her, carrying copies. Rachel Dunn stood near the back wall with her camera and notebook. Reverend Gray came slowly, leaning on his cane. But he came. Behind them came others. Tasha Green's mother, Eli Turner's aunt, Caleb Morris's mother, 3 elderly women from the church, 2 men who had once been boys on Mercy Road, parents who had been afraid for years and were still afraid now. But fear, Helen noticed, did not keep them home anymore. At the front of the room, Warren Pike sat behind the long table with the board members. Beside him were the superintendent, the county inspector, and a lawyer in a dark suit. The same gold-lettered motto hung on the wall: "Every child matters." Helen heard Rachel's camera click. Warren opened the meeting with a calm voice. "We are not here tonight to debate rumors," he said. "We are here to protect public safety. The old Mercy Road structure is unstable, unfit for occupancy, and legally subject to removal." Marcus stood. "We object to demolition until the state investigation reviews the records found inside the property." Warren's eyes narrowed. "This is not a courtroom, Mr. Vale." "No," Marcus said, "but it may become evidence in one." A murmur moved through the room. Warren tapped his pen once. "Miss Mercer, since you are the current owner, you may speak briefly. I ask that you stay on the subject of the building." Helen walked to the front. Her hands were cold, but her voice did not shake. "The building is damaged," she said. "The roof needs repair. The windows need replacing. The floor needs reinforcement." Warren nodded, as if she had helped him. "But the building is not empty." She opened the cardboard box. "These are copies of records found beneath the floorboards under the teacher's table. Enrollment lists, parent letters, funding summaries, attendance corrections. Some are from 1968. Some are from this year." The lawyer leaned toward his microphone. "Miss Mercer is a terminated employee with no authority to interpret district documents." Helen looked at him. "You can question my employment. You cannot erase the facts." The room quieted. She lifted one page. In 1968, Amos Gray, age 8, Mercy Road, was marked transferred. "Reverend Gray, would you please stand if you were transferred to another school that year?" Reverend Gray rose slowly. "No, ma'am," he said. "I was sent home." Helen lifted another page. "Della Freeman, age 9, was marked relocated. Her sister is here tonight." An elderly woman in the second row stood with a photograph in her hand. "My sister never relocated," she said. "She waited outside the county school for 2 weeks. Then she stopped asking to go." Helen continued. She did not shout. She read, name after name, year after year. Some people lowered their eyes. Some began to cry. Some looked toward Warren as if waiting for him to explain how paper could sound so much like testimony. Then Helen lifted a newer page. Caleb Morris was marked transferred on October 7th of this year. Caleb's mother stood. "My son was not transferred," she said. Her voice broke, then steadied. "He was home with me because the bus stopped coming down our road." The superintendent whispered something to Warren. Warren's expression tightened. "This is emotional manipulation," he said. "We sympathize with struggling families, but administrative records are complicated. Miss Mercer is presenting fragments without context." Rachel stepped forward from the back wall. "The first article with scanned copies of those fragments went live 20 minutes ago," she said. "The state office has confirmed receipt of the complaint." The room erupted. Warren struck the table with his palm. "Order." But the word had lost its old power. Marcus placed a set of documents in front of the board secretary. These copies show enrollment irregularities tied to funding claims across multiple years. They also show that the schoolhouse was never properly released for demolition under state community education property rules. Destroying it now could constitute destruction of relevant evidence. The county inspector looked down at his own papers as if seeing them for the first time. The lawyer beside Warren stood. This is absurd. These are old grievances being used to delay a routine safety decision. Helen reached into her ledger and removed Miss Boone's letter. This was written by Althea Boone, a teacher in this county for 32 years. She kept copies because originals disappeared. Warren's face changed, only a little, but Helen saw it. "You recognize the name," she said. "Everyone recognizes old teachers," Warren replied. Helen read from the letter. W. Pike says the county cannot afford to count children who do not help the county look improved. The room went still. Warren's grandfather's portrait hung in the district office. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew the W. Warren pushed back his chair. "My grandfather is not on trial." "No," Helen said. "But his system is." A board member, near the end of the table, a woman who had not spoken all evening, leaned toward Warren. "Did you know these records were under the schoolhouse?" Warren did not answer quickly enough. Helen saw the mistake before he spoke. "That building has been searched before," he said. Marcus turned sharply. "Searched by whom?" Warren froze. Rachel's pen stopped moving. The board member stared at him. "You said the building was empty." Warren recovered. "But too late. I meant inspected." "No," Helen said. "You meant searched." Deputy Maddox stood near the side door. He removed his hat. "I believe this matter needs to be turned over to the state before any demolition decision is made." The lawyer snapped. "Deputy, you are not authorized." "My father's signature is on one of those notices," Maddox said. "And I am not helping bury what he may have helped carry." Silence followed. Then Tasha Green's mother stepped into the aisle. "My daughter was told her address could not be verified," she said. "We lived in the same trailer for 4 years. Eli Turner's aunt stood next. "My nephew lost reading support because the school said he withdrew." He did not withdraw. He was sitting in Miss Mercer's room. Another parent rose, then another. The meeting no longer belonged to Warren Pike. Helen stood beside the evidence box and listened as the room filled with the voices of people who had been trained to speak softly. For years, the system had survived because each family thought its hurt was separate. One missing bus stop, one rejected form, one altered name, one child sent home. Now the pieces touched. Warren tried once more. "These accusations will damage the district," he said. Helen turned to him. "No," she said. "What damaged the district was counting money while refusing to count children." No one laughed. No one whispered. The sentence stood by itself. The board member at the end of the table closed her folder. "I move to suspend demolition pending investigation." Another board member seconded it. Warren objected. But his voice sounded smaller now. Trapped behind procedure he no longer controlled. The motion passed. The schoolhouse would stand, for now. Outside, under the meeting hall lights, families gathered in the damp parking lot. Some cried, some hugged, some simply stood close together, stunned by the sound of their own truth in public air. Reverend Gray touched Helen's arm. "Miss Boone would have liked tonight," he said. Helen looked back through the glass doors. Warren Pike remained inside, speaking urgently with the lawyer, his face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. "This isn't over," Marcus warned softly. Helen nodded. She knew, but for the first time since Caleb's name disappeared, the door was no longer shut from the other side. And this time, Helen was not standing outside it alone. The investigation did not move quickly. Truth, Helen learned, did not rise like lightning. It rose like water through old ground, slow at first, then everywhere. State investigators came to Mercy Road in plain cars. They photographed the schoolhouse, measured the floor opening, sealed boxes of records, and interviewed families at the teacher's table. They wore gloves when handling Miss Boone's letter. They labeled every folder. They copied every list. Helen watched them carry the first evidence box out through the front door and felt a strange ache in her chest. For weeks, she had protected those papers as if they were children sleeping in a storm. Now she had to let them go. Marcus stood beside her on the porch. "This is good," he said. "I know. You don't sound like you know." Helen looked at the red clay road, at the scraped sign, at the tire tracks where so many people had come and gone since the hearing. "I keep thinking paper can disappear," Marcus nodded. That is why we made copies. Rachel's second article spread farther than the first. Then a state paper picked it up. Then a television station sent a van that got stuck in the mud and had to be pulled out by Reverend Gray's old pickup. The story changed shape once it left the county. At first, people called it a scandal. Then they called it fraud. Then, when more families came forward from other roads and other years, they called it what Helen had felt from the beginning. A pattern. Warren Pike resigned before the charges were announced, but resignation did not save him. The superintendent was suspended. 2 district administrators were removed from their positions. The state ordered a full audit of enrollment, funding claims, transportation records, and special services. The old board was dissolved pending review. For the first time in Helen's life, people in pressed suits stood in front of cameras and said the words, "Mercy Road," without lowering their voices. Still, the part that mattered most to Helen happened quietly. It happened in a temporary office set up inside the county library, where families came one by one to correct school records. Caleb Morris sat beside his mother with his library book in his lap. When the official asked him to confirm his name, he sat a little straighter. "Caleb James Morris," he said. Helen stood near the wall and looked down so he would not see her cry. Tasha Green's address was restored. Eli Turner's services were reinstated. Children marked transferred were marked present again. Older names could not all be repaired in the same way. Some children had grown old. Some had died. Some had left the state long ago. But the county created a public record of correction, and Reverend Gray was the first to sign. He wrote Amos Gray in slow, careful letters. Then he touched the pen to the paper once more, as if blessing it. The schoolhouse was declared a protected historic community education site. Not because it was grand, not because anyone famous had studied there, but because it held proof of what ordinary families had survived. A repair fund was created from state penalties and recovered money. Families harmed by the altered records were given access to legal review, education support, and back services for their children. One afternoon, Warren Pike's lawyer sent Helen a final offer through Marcus, a private settlement, a statement of mutual misunderstanding. Money, if she agreed to stop speaking publicly. Helen read the paper once. Then she handed it back. "No," Marcus smiled slightly. "That is the whole response?" Helen looked through the schoolhouse window at Caleb, helping Reverend Gray stack old desks. "No," she said. "Tell them this goes out under their names." Months earlier, the district had taken Helen's classroom. Now the state offered to reinstate her in a new position at the county school. It was a good offer. Better pay, clean building, health insurance, a proper office. Helen thanked them. Then she turned it down. Instead, she applied to reopen the Mercy Road Schoolhouse as a community learning room. After-school reading, record help for parents, tutoring for children the system had missed, and a place where families could bring papers no one else had explained to them. The approval came on a Friday. Helen read the letter twice, standing beside the blackboard. Reverend Gray was the first person she called. By sunset, half the road seemed to know. Someone brought paint. Someone brought lumber. Someone brought coffee in a dented thermos. Deputy Maddox arrived with 2 boxes of donated books and pretended not to notice when people stared at his badge. For the first time, the schoolhouse was not being searched, condemned, or threatened. It was being repaired. Helen stood in the doorway as hammers sounded behind her. The roof still sagged. The windows still needed work. The floor still bore the square scar where the hidden stairs had waited. But the building was no longer a secret, and neither were the children. The repairs took longer than anyone expected. Old buildings, Helen learned, did not become whole because people loved them. They became whole because people returned, day after day, with tools in their hands and patience in their bones. The roof was patched first, not replaced, not yet, just made honest enough to keep the rain from falling on children's heads. 2 men from the church climbed ladders with shingles stacked under one arm. Caleb Morris stood below, with Reverend Gray, handing up nails from a coffee can, as if he had been trusted with treasure. The broken windows came next. Rachel wrote an article about the restoration, and a glass company from the next county donated panes. When the new glass went in, Sunlight entered the schoolhouse differently. It no longer sliced through cracks and holes. It spread across the floor in wide, warm rectangles. Helen kept one broken pane. She placed it on a shelf near the old attendance books, a reminder of how long the room had waited open to weather. The floor was repaired around the hidden stairs, but Helen refused to cover the place completely. The opening was framed, secured, and fitted with a small wooden door. Beneath it, the basement records were gone now, sealed in state archives and copied in county files. But the space remained. A witness did not stop being a witness because its testimony had been heard. The blackboard stayed. A contractor offered to replace it with a whiteboard, clean and bright and modern. Helen said no, so they washed the old slate carefully. The crack down the middle remained, thin as a river on a map. Helen liked it that way. Some things did not need to look unbroken to be useful. On the first Monday of the community learning program, Helen arrived before sunrise. She wore the gray dress, mended at the hem. Her hair was pinned at the back of her neck. In one hand, she carried the blue ledger. In the other, she carried Miss Boone's short pencil, still wrapped in cotton cloth. The schoolhouse smelled of pine boards, chalk dust, coffee, and new paint. Desks stood in 2 neat rows. Not many. Enough. A pot of pencils sat on the teacher's table. Beside it was a stack of blank forms for parents who needed help with records, bus routes, meal applications, and letters no one had explained to them. Above the blackboard, Rachel had rehung Helen's old wooden sign. A name is a beginning. For a long while, Helen stood alone in the room and looked at those words. Then she opened the blue ledger to a fresh page. The first child through the door was Caleb Morris. He came with his library book under one arm and his mother behind him. He had combed his hair flat for the occasion, but one piece still stood up in the back. "Morning, Miss Mercer," he said. "Good morning, Caleb." He paused near the first desk. "Am I on the list?" Helen looked down at the open ledger. "Yes," she said. "You are." He sat. Then came Tasha Green, wearing purple sneakers someone had donated. Then Eli Turner, carrying the spelling test his aunt had framed in a plastic sleeve. Then 2 younger children Helen did not know yet, both shy, both watching the room as if afraid it might reject them. Helen greeted every child by name. She wrote each one carefully, full name, date, seat, guardian, notes. Not because a computer had failed, not because paper was magic, because attention was a form of love. And Helen had learned that neglect often began with someone saying it did not matter. Reverend Gray arrived after the children were seated. He took the last desk by the wall, the one nearest the stove. His hands rested on his cane. His eyes moved over the room, and for a moment, Helen saw the 8-year-old boy he had been, waiting for someone to call him present. She picked up the chalk. The room quieted. Outside, wind moved through the Georgia pines. Sunlight touched the scraped school sign by the road. Someone had repainted the words, "Mercy School," but they had also restored the missing word beneath it, the word someone had cut away years before. Community. Helen wrote on the board. Every child counted. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Caleb raised his hand. "Yes?" Helen said. "Do we say present?" Helen smiled. "If you want to." He sat a little taller. "Present." Tasha followed. "Present." Then Eli. Then the younger children. At the back of the room, Reverend Gray's voice came last, low and rough with age. "Present." Helen pressed the chalk against the board until her hand steadied. For the first time in months, she did not feel like a woman trying to prove she had not been erased. She felt like a teacher standing exactly where she was meant to stand. By afternoon, the room had filled with ordinary sounds. Pages turning, pencils scratching, a chair leg dragging, children whispering over a reading worksheet, a mother at the side table asking Marcus Vale how to correct a school address form. Nothing grand, nothing loud, only the patient noise of repair. When evening came, families left slowly. Reverend Gray lingered on the porch. Rachel took one photograph through the window, not of Helen, but of the blackboard full of names. After everyone was gone, Helen swept the floor. She moved between the desks in the golden light, gathering pencil shavings, paper scraps, and red dust tracked in from the road. At the teacher's table, she opened the small glass case Rachel had brought and placed Miss Boone's pencil inside. Beside it, she laid a card written in her own hand. Write your name where they cannot erase it. Then Helen turned down the lamp, stepped onto the porch, and locked the door. The road outside was quiet. Not empty, quiet. Behind her, warm light glowed through the schoolhouse windows, falling across the repaired floor, the old blackboard, and the names still written in chalk. The world had called Helen Mercer disposable. It had called the schoolhouse worthless. But she had stayed long enough to listen, and in the end, the forgotten place had given back what both of them had been denied. A name, a future, and a room where every child could answer. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to remember that being counted out is not the same as being gone.